what or who inspired you to go into law enforcement?
Absolutely. So glad
And
to be here today.
college, so you knew at a young age it's what you wanted to
Yeah,
do.
yeah. So my dad was the county sheriff when I was growing up in the county that I grew up in, Shiawassee County, which is central Michigan area. And I remember going with him to like the restaurant or to the neighborhood event or to the store, and him constantly being stopped. Can you help me with this situation? What do you think about this? Can I get some advice? And I just remember him stopping everything and answering whatever question or dealing with whatever circumstance he could. And he was just truly a helper in the community. And I always wanted to do that when I grew up. I just always wanted to help people and be somebody that somebody could count on in a situation where they had a need. So I pursued that career right from a very early age. I went to the Army to help pay for college because I didn't have the means to pay for college. And I got so much out of that, some tremendous leadership experiences that really gave me the confidence to take a leadership role at the sheriff's office from a very early part of my career. And I have really just always worked very hard to make sure that every project that I could get on, every opportunity to lead, I took a chance to do that. And 32 years later, I found myself as the Kent County Sheriff. So who would have thought, right? So yeah, it's been a tremendous role, and I feel very blessed to lead this team, particularly in this time because it's so troubled. But I have an amazing staff here, and actually I'll introduce Bree, who is my administrative assistant and just a wonderful person and helps us kind of move along every day and part of the team here at the Sheriff's Office.
Can you tell us a little bit about, obviously we're in some very turbulent times right now, with a lot going on, but also there's been a lot of different executive orders that have come down over the past few months. And can you tell us a little bit of how you've led and I guess directed your team through the various orders and
Yes.
whether they're enforced or not, or how that works? Because it seems to be
Certainly
very different throughout the state.
Yeah, so let me give a little context before we get in that, because I know we do have people from all over the state. Kent County has about 650,000 people who call Kent County their home. Of that 650,000 individuals, about 450 of them are policed directly by the Kent County Sheriff's Office. I have a staff of about 700 people. More than half of them are assigned to the Kent County Jail. And the Kent County Jail is under the responsibility of the Sheriff's Office along with the dispatch center. The county jail typically would hold about 1,100 individuals on an average daily count. Right now we're down to about 650. One of the significant factors for county jails with the executive orders were that we really looked for ways to release people from jail because of the increased risk it might pose for them to be in a high population area during the COVID crisis in Michigan. And there have been a number of executive orders related to that. So anybody who had significant physical, medical history, and they could be released without posing a jeopardy to the community, we work to get placement for them outside in the community. Largely speaking, law enforcement in Michigan have not made arrests when it didn't need to happen for the public safety. That's been happening throughout Michigan. Most sheriff's departments are taking the same approach on it. Like I said, we were down to 650, which my entire career, we've never had a count that low. And we're remaining at that until the COVID risk is beyond Michigan. There's a vaccination or that the infection level is such that we don't believe it's a jeopardy. So one of the executive orders had a lot to do with the jails. Obviously, we've seen a lot of variations of executive orders issued from the governor that affected most people in our community. The sheriff's office, in every circumstance, if we receive a complaint that somebody is not abiding by the executive orders or there's some kind of risk that's been introduced, we will go out and talk to the individual. Bottom line is there's a variety of different opinions out there, whether the executive orders are lawful or if there's going to be some kind of court ruling, and I always point back to there are three branches of government. There's the legislative branch of government, there's the executive branch of government, and there's a judicial branch of government. And as a sheriff, I don't think it's my job to decide which laws I like, which laws I don't like, which ones I want to follow or don't follow. So I try to support the community and make sure that we take an educational approach. We go out, we say, okay, there's a complaint about this. How can we manage through this situation? You know, certainly in today's environment where somebody has to have a mask on to be served in the community, unless in a public place, unless they have a medical condition. We educate people on that, and we try to keep people from being put into a bad situation where the police won't come out. I have not had to write a single citation on executive orders. We've always gotten compliance. We've always been able to work through in an educational way. It's honestly how we approach law enforcement in general as an organization. So we have a lot of very cooperative citizens. We certainly have some that haven't been, but they respond to the educational approach. So on that front, those were some of the executive orders. And then there have been some executive orders related to police professionalism, oversight, and training is probably how I would title those. And, you know, and I think that's a broader conversation. So much of the call nationally has been for transparency, oversight, and police training. I would say most of the calls. Those are professional standards that really have been in place for decades, for many, many, many agencies, but they're not agencies that haven't met those professional standards that typically where we will see an issue. So, you know, our policies, we did review them when the George Floyd murder happened, and looked for any indications in our policies that there might be gaps there. Frankly, there weren't gaps there. We had all of the policies in place, no chokeholds. We have a requirement in place that our officers must report and must intervene. And I don't have any hesitation to say I would not see an officer in my department participating in an event like that or anything close to it. But you know, you have to have policy, but you also have to have training and oversight. And as I talk to different groups, and one of the things we emphasize here at our department is it's not just a matter of policy, but it is a matter of culture. What is the culture in your department, and how are you expected to treat every individual you come into contact with? If you're not expected to treat them with kindness, empathy, compassion, and respect, when you step over the line and the bar is to treat everybody with kindness, compassion, empathy, and respect, that means you're rude. And when you're rude, we can deal with that very early. We can have consequences for a person. We could, you know, we can get somebody out of the industry. But if your bar is that people aren't brutal, when somebody steps over the line and they have an incident where they've stepped over the line, that means they've then been brutal to somebody, and that's way too late to intervene in an employee relationship. So I just advocate, as I talk to different people, make sure that what you're asking or demanding even from your police departments are that they're compassionate, kind, empathetic, and responsive, and you know, that they are approaching law enforcement as a help to the community, not a control over the community. Because when you're approaching it as a control over the community, there will always be difficulties.
Now then, what about the protests? Can you talk about that at all and how that's been handled? And what
I mean, so we have, and again, I know this group is throughout Michigan, and there's been a variety of demonstrations and protests. I like to use demonstration more, to be honest, because I think largely as people have taken the time to go out and voice their concerns, voice their vision, they are demonstrating their unity and support for the community. So I think it's important when as we look at everything that has happened, there certainly have been some protests and there has been some riot situations within Michigan. Those have been relatively limited, but the demonstrations have been ongoing. So one of your constitutional rights is to speak your mind and to talk in unity with people who are like-minded and do so in a public place. And frankly, I have been defending people's ability to do that my entire career. I support that completely. And I honestly, it's our history, right? It's our foundation of government. And I think it's really, really important. And I think changes do happen in society and expectations of what people want, need, expect. And so I think it's really important to have that forum. I would not do anything to reduce somebody's ability to unite and talk about their needs. The riot situations that happen really in Grand Rapids, I can speak to pretty directly. There are a circumstance where there are individuals who had an agenda and in some cases a social terrorist agenda to come in and create violence in communities. And essentially, I think when individuals do that, they steal the voice of the people who are trying to talk about needs, demonstrate their desires to have a change. But now somebody comes in and creates violence. It actually creates a situation where the demonstration has to be dispersed for public safety, and it causes a very difficult circumstance. Luckily in Grand Rapids, that has been limited to just one evening. And beyond that, we've had a lot of success in working together and working for social reform. And I'm hopeful that we see progress, right? That we see outcomes that people are happy with.
Okay, the question I wanted you to address is how does local law enforcement and you specifically feel about the possibility of federal officials being sent to cities around the country? Select cities, I should say.
Yeah, I can speak for Kent County and the Grand Rapids area. I would say it's not necessary. There has to be federal forces are different than state forces like National Guard. I don't really want to get into a lot of details, but I don't know if people commonly know that National Guard actually work for a governor. And the governor has the ability to use the National Guard in circumstances of a state of emergency. And that actually did happen the night of our riot here in Grand Rapids. They declared a state of emergency. National Guard resources were brought in, but they're not enforcement. They were the Army Corps of Engineers. They help secure buildings where glass had been broken. They help barricade off parts of the community that are no longer safe because of the glass being broken out. That's what the National Guard largely does. They do have a riot control element, but they are defensive. They're not offensive. And there's a very, very key difference in that. The federal forces do not have the same mission. That's not what federal forces are typically used for or trained to do. And I think using federal forces poses a lot of risk because if somebody is not trained for the specific mission that they're completing, they make mistakes. Training is very key in being able to accomplish what you need to accomplish from a public safety standpoint, but doing it in a way that doesn't jeopardize anybody's safety or as limited jeopardy as possible. And that's just not how federal resources are trained. It's interesting, I have a son who served in the Air Force in security forces, which is the military police of the Air Force. And he was quite upset to hear the prospect of federal forces being asked to hold this mission in our community because it's just not what they're trained to do. So one, I don't think it's feasible. Two, I don't think he really has the authority to do it in the way that it's being implied. And three, I don't think it's necessary at all.
Carrie, are you picking up any questions
So there's a
from?
couple questions in the chat. One is related to diversity in the force, and the other is what is your view on social injustice? I guess they're not exactly the same, but that's some of what the questions are right now. So did you want to talk a little bit about those two things?
Yeah, and I can weave them in together. So
Yeah.
when I was appointed in 2018, the first thing we did was to start a process of doing a strategic plan, a 5-year strategic plan, which I know is pretty much taken for granted in most business organizations, but it's not as commonly done in like a sheriff's department or a police department because our mission seems pretty clear, right? Somebody calls 911 and you go. But really, when you're directing forces appropriately, you do a lot of very proactive work. And one of the initiatives, we made 4 priorities. One of our 4 priorities was community outreach engagement for transparency. Part of that community engagement effort is directed at recruiting a more diverse workforce. And when I say diversity, I mean it in every way possible. When people are very like positioned, i.e. maybe they're a white male or a white female, or they have all the same tenure in the department or have all the same background getting to the department, we tend to think very similar to each other. And law enforcement in particular tends to be very heavily weighted towards white males and actually even generationally older white males. So they tend not to look at the bigger picture and how maybe police practices are affecting others in our community. So we have had an eye on diversifying our force for some time now, but very specifically in writing with measurables for the next 5 years under my direction. It's a challenging thing. We don't get a lot of applications from people of color or women, proportionally speaking. So we are working really hard to understand what would make this field more attractive to individuals who maybe represent a different part of our community.
I just one of those, I guess a conversational topic, as we talk about, I think that, there's been this dialogue about defunding the police, but I think that a lot of what the police is asked to do are as far as social service aspects to it, those are generally roles that I guess more women end up filling. So if there's some way to figure out like how do you draw from the population that is interested in helping our community in that way and make the police or law enforcement seem more equitable, I guess. So the another question we have is what we're a women-based professional group. So this is a question that's if you have a particular story that would come to mind, I think we'd be interested in hearing it. What is one of the biggest challenges you have faced as a woman in a predominantly male-dominated workforce, and how did you handle it?
Many.
Yes, I'm sure.
Probably a lot.
Yeah, a couple of things, and I agree with you. Often women police officers, and I hate to generalize about anybody because I've certainly run into some female officers who are not good at communication, but often that is our strength. We're very, very good at communication. And, and I think it's difficult for people to understand sometimes, but when a big old burly guy rolls out of a police car, there are a number of people who are looking for a fight against the big old burly guy. Like it's this challenge that they have in the back of their head. I've always wanted to fight a police officer. So they do get some of that. I don't. When I roll out of that police car, they will talk. Often now, like I'm their mom, and tell me things they really shouldn't be telling me. So it is an advantage of being a female. I've had a lot of opportunity to de-escalate circumstances long before any physical force would really be necessary. But the challenge often has been, and I'm sure everybody here has been through this, but they assume the guy's in charge. So I actually have a pretty funny story with a local reporter. When I first got named lieutenant down in one of our sectors, we had about 24 officers. I was in the South sector, and I'm on a pretty large accident scene. And I get out of the car, and the reporter approaches me and starts to complain about the lieutenant, which I'm the lieutenant. I've got the emblems on my collar. Yeah, the lieutenant says they can't release any information, and he's just talking about what an idiot the lieutenant is. And then I stop him about halfway through, and I was like, yeah, it's kind of a pain when they do that. And I'm just talking to him, and then I finally say, okay, hi, I'm Lieutenant Young. Nice to meet you. And he was like, oh, okay. Well, it's funny because now I talk to him all the time over the years, but it's just, often people don't expect you to be in charge, especially in a police organization. I've always been pretty amused by it. I really have never taken any of it to heart because that doesn't define me. Somebody doesn't have that authority over my life. So I'm just going to keep rolling through, and I try to use it for an advantage. It's kind of nice to be able to garner the attention. I don't have to fight for focus. People know who I am in the organization. They don't get me mixed up with anybody else, turns out. So that's always kind of nice to have as a start. There's goods and bad with it. But I do think we have to market that part of law enforcement more effectively. And I think we have to do it for all of our diversity needs. When you're viewed as a control arm, not very many people want to be part of that kind of negative connotation. So you really have to make sure that your organization is representing itself as we are guardians of the community, and we are here to help the community in whatever capacity that is. And sometimes it's social work, sometimes it's a mental health professional, sometimes it's daycare, sometimes it's elderly care. I can't tell you how many times I've been called to check on somebody's well-being, and it's a lonely old person who nobody has been at their house in 3 weeks. And you're just there talking to them and finding out if they're okay. There's all of those facets of law enforcement. And when people talk about defunding and segregating out law enforcement, there will always have to be a part. In fact, by the state constitution, they can't defund the sheriff's office. We have to be there. We're required to respond. But what happens is you take everything else out of that mission, off that list, and it becomes even more only a control arm of the government. It would be very difficult to have that blended approach, and you end up having people who specialize in responding only to emergency calls. They become very one-sided and frankly very burnt out very quickly, because the helping part feeds your soul. That's what keeps you driving forward to do it tomorrow. If we don't feed police officers' souls, we're all going to be in trouble. Nobody will want to do it, and it's very difficult to train a police officer to be competent to do what they need to do. And if we change over every 2-3 years, you will find less competency, less heart, and I think less satisfaction with the way police work is being managed.
I have a question as far as these so-called oversight boards there's talk of. That's with the citizens, I guess, so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are absolutely circumstances where police agencies haven't done the right thing. So, I personally am not afraid of any oversight. I mean, if somebody is qualified to evaluate a circumstance, and that's kind of the key. We would never have a group of citizens evaluating medical care or law practice or a professional service. And there are absolutely very professional components of law enforcement that, a general citizen group doesn't have the background to evaluate. But if the citizen group were qualified to evaluate it and separate from the law enforcement agency so that they could be impartial, I don't have any issue with that. Being a law enforcement officer entails having a license. There are criteria involved to get the license. There are very limited criteria involved in maintaining it in the state of Michigan. I think that could use some updating, although most of us, my officers train about 60 hours a year. Continuing ed credits, but what's required is about 2 hours a year. So that could be definitely improved. And then that oversight body would have some opportunity to deny credentials to somebody who's acting outside of the professional standard.
So we have a question from the chat. What is the single biggest change you would like to see in the coming months based on recent events and demonstrations? So what do you see happening, I guess, where are we going to be 6 months from now?
6 months is a pretty short timeline, particularly given everything that's going on with COVID, but there have been a lot of very valuable conversations. I think there is definitely a new vocabulary that's out in the greater understanding of the community. This vocabulary has been there. This conversation's been here. This is not new conversation, but I think the fact that we're all sharing these common experiences through social media, and we actually have the time to engage in it right now, I think that has some positive outcome. I personally have been involved in several panel discussions that I wouldn't otherwise have been involved in, and I think talking about these things in a community has positive outcome. It also has the ability to create some divisiveness, but I think if we all work hard to keep the conversation forward, keep the conversation positive, it'll have some good outcomes. I think you will see some tangible professional standards that will be added and then required. I don't know if 6 months is a rational goal, because government takes longer than that. It just does, to get through all the process and given the intervening issues right now. But I think a year from now, you'll see some things. And I really hope that in Michigan in particular, there's this group called the Jail Task Force that's been meeting over the last 18 months. They have a series of recommendations that are there to align who's being brought into the criminal justice system, i.e. brought to jail, because that's typically, that's when it gets real for somebody. You're not paying a fine anymore, you're getting brought to jail, and it interrupts your life. And those circumstances around who gets brought to jail and then kept in jail, I think really needs some revisions, some updates, and I think you'll see some legislative movement on those. I'm hoping to see some improvements. There are some circumstances that essentially cause, if you will, an imbalance based on your ability to pay, which obviously affects communities of color more often. Not exclusively. It absolutely is a socioeconomic tie that I'm seeing with some of these incidences, driving with license suspended specifically, failure to pay child support specifically. So inability to pay a bond on like a shoplifting, for example. All these things account for the most common reasons that somebody is lodged in jail. And if we can start getting rid of some of those factors, we can start getting real about the criminal charges and what should bring you to jail.
So I have a question as far as what do you see yourself doing after sheriff? Or what do you?
Well, right now I'm actually running for re-election, and frankly, I can barely see what I'm doing tomorrow, let alone after I'm sheriff. I'm hoping to retain the job for another 4 years, but I have a new grandbaby coming in January. I have 2 wonderful kids that I love to spend time with. I love to travel, and I think I will do some volunteer work. Particularly, I feel pretty strongly about work I'm doing on the YWCA board, Children's Advocacy Center board, Boys and Girls Club board, and I like doing that kind of work. Sometimes I don't have enough time for doing as much of it as I'd like, so I'd see myself doing that. Maybe perhaps some consultant work, but I have been all in 100% of the time for 32 years, like 24-hour days for 32 years. So I might just sleep really hard too.
No politics for you?
Yeah, no, not my thing. No. No, this is enough. I realize I got to run for re-election to keep my job. It's the only reason